Now it looks like we're recording. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to do that. And now we can talk. So we were talking about Jacques Louis David. We had sort of laid the groundwork for this by looking at Rococo art of the earlier 18th century and began to talk about neoclassicism as a answer to that, response to the Rococo, right? That it's was responding in many ways to particular criticisms about this sort of frivolous kind of art. They wanted something that had a little bit more heft, a little bit more moral gravity, right? Something that was really kind of important and lasting. And so we were looking at Jacques Louis David as our first neoclassicist artist, and for France at least, he's certainly the most important one. He was a very, very prominent painter in the late 18th and early 19th century, and as we'll see today, had a really kind of fascinating career insofar as his relationship to politics in particular, right? So we talked at the very end of class on Tuesday last that Andromache mourning Hector was his submission to the French Royal Academy for master's status, right? This was his masterpiece. And the image borrows from Homer. It's a story out of the Iliad, which is the extended story of the Trojan War. Right? And during the siege of Troy, that's what the Trojan War is, right? During the siege of Troy, Hector was killed by Achilles, and it's accidental. So what we're seeing in this picture is the body of Hector being returned to his family. Right? His wife, Andromache, is mourning and holding their son in his lap. And you can see that there's a Roman helmet in the lower left corner, proper Roman costumes and furniture. David had won the annual Prix de Rome. I think I've got that next. Is that coming up? Yeah, the Prix de Rome. The Rome Prize. The Royal Academy gave a prize to an up-and-coming young artist every year. You could only win it once, right? So you wouldn't get it every year. And the prize was to go spend a year in Rome studying antiquities, studying the great legacy of Greece and Rome on somebody else's dime, right? So for a year, all expenses paid, you get to go to Rome. And David went in 1774, studied buildings, studied artifacts, studied ancient statues, and these things all appear again and again in his works, sort of filtered into these stories because he'd done all that. He also turned to the Renaissance. He liked that as well. And he also loved Baroque art because of the drama. And he kind of sifts this stuff all together. And so you can see that you might, almost mistake this for a Caravaggio in a way, with the really strong lighting and the kind of earth tones, right? And the heavy drama. Remember Caravaggio, right? The Calling of St. Matthew, right? St. Peter falling on the ground in front of the horse. And again, with a dark background and bright lighting. And he loves Caravaggio. He'd gone to Rome, right? He'd seen them all. And he brings these together, but in a much more sort of, it's not as active. There's not as many strong diagonals that activate the composition. It's fairly sedate, except for the human drama and the dramatic lighting. So you'll notice he really wants to make this as dramatic as possible. So there she's looking out at us. It's kind of overly emotional. It's like, right? Feel like I feel, look, and my poor son. And it's sort of like a treacly movie, like a rom-com or something where they want you to know they finally got together at the end of the movie. And here's the little, you're meant to feel for the little boy who's lost his dad and he doesn't understand what death means. And she's so overcome with grief, she can't explain it to him yet. She's looking up to the heavens. How could this possibly have happened, right? We're supposedly the good guys. How could he die from friendly fire, yada, 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 right? So it's all about making it as an emotional as he can through gestures and through facial features as well, and highlighting it with that light. And, why does she have one breast exposed? Probably because he saw a statue that looked that way. I don't think it makes any sense for the story, right? On the left, we see a portrait of Jacques Louis David by one of his pupils. As I mentioned, David was really kind of the show in in France in the late 18th century. He's the most prominent, most successful painter of his day. And almost everybody that paints in the generation after him seems to have worked their way through the David studio at one point or another, right? Because this is the way you trained as an artist when you were of that period, is that you apprenticed under a master instead of going to school, right? So the Royal Academy isn't an academy of school like Marymount, right? The Royal Academy is simply the governing body of the artists. And so young artists would be then put with somebody as an apprentice. And that's where they learn how to grind paints, how to mix the pigment into the oil, right? How to stretch a canvas, how to prime a canvas, right? How to paint on wood, everything. Drawing, drafts, all same place. Gracie. That's a really good question. I didn't look into this as much because I really didn't want to spend a ton of time on all of David's, but he does seem rather awkwardly placed, doesn't he, with his shoulders out and his chest out with the cavity down below. I don't know how Hector was killed, and so it may have something to do with that, right? But it may be how people were laid on funerary biers, and a bier is the table, right? It may reflect the fact that David had studied quite a few ancient sarcophagi in his time, and it may be that he's pulled one particular one out. But that's where if this were a term paper and this were a National Gallery work, that's the sort of thing one might look into, right? Would be why that is. I can't tell you. Right? Yeah. He is, of course, dead, right? I mean, and I think that it's not meant to be sort of, I don't know, choose somebody, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, right? Monster, steroid kind of guy. I think that he's propped up, and I think that if you follow the rib cage, right, I think there's something underneath his back that, right? Well, here I can do this and draw on it, right? Smart floating tools. Look at this, right? So what you can do is, like, I think there's something under there that makes it stiff up like that, right? Isn't that cool? I'm still green at this, right? I still don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm working on it, right? Okay, let's go back, right? So I don't have an answer to that. So we'll move forward to the next slide now. Our picture by David, we have a couple, but I'm only going to really discuss this one, this portrait of Napoleon, which, as you can see, is quite much later in his career. The last picture we saw was 1780. We talked about him winning the Rome Prize for Young Artists in 1774. So this is almost 40 years later. Getting toward the end of his career, he's, I believe, at this point, pushing 70, late 60s or so. But he is one of the official court painters to Napoleon, right? And what we'll see today is that David's life was deeply involved in politics. So we're really, a couple times in this class, where we've got to talk about history. We've got to talk about political history just to make sense of it all. And this is one of those times. So it's almost like a French history lesson with pictures, right? David began his career when he was a young artist in the 70s, working for the circle of the French king. Right? This is before the Revolution, French Revolution, 1789. Right? So he begins around 1780, making his mark, and he works for the circle of the French king, who was Louis XVI, was the French king, and he's the last French king before the Revolution. Yeah? He's the husband of Marie Antoinette. Okay, and he's killed right after the Revolution. He's beheaded, 1793, 94. Right, as is Marie Antoinette, as is their son, the infant Louis XVII. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. We'll talk more about this. We love the French Revolution for the idea of freedom, but boy, did they butcher. I mean, they invented the guillotine for this, right? I mean, they wanted to do it efficiently. Go anywhere in Paris, anywhere in France, and find Place de la République, place of the Republic. That's where they set up the guillotines. Right? That's where the heads rolled. 1,000 plus a month for a year. It's insane, isn't it? It's crazy. You get a guillotine, you get something really efficient. I'm seriously. Well, that's all over the country now, mind you. That's not just in Paris, right? Because otherwise, that's like, yeah, line them up, right? But that's not the case. So David begins working for the crown, right? He begins working for the French king before the Revolution. During the revolution, he fell in tight with the revolutionaries, especially the most radical wing of the revolutionaries. He signed, along with the other revolutionaries, he signed the death warrant for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Right? He's in. He's tight. Right? When the revolutionaries were overthrown by Napoleon, this is a little French history, right? When the revolutionaries were overthrown by Napoleon in 1799, David becomes Napoleon's portrait painter. Even though I read this morning that Napoleon only ever sat for him once. Most of these are just constructions, right? Napoleon's too busy, to be sitting down to have his portrait painted. So he sat for him once, never again, right? I guess that's why he always looks pretty much the same age, right? So these two are about the same time, right? David's sitting for his pupil or someone from that group, Georges Rouget, around the time that is the end of Napoleon's career. Napoleon is leader of France from 1799 to 1815, when he's overthrown at the Battle of Waterloo, which you've probably heard about, if only for an ABBA song, right? But beyond that, we see him here sort of at the height of his power in France. So we have to imagine that the guy on the left is painting the thing on the right about the same time he's sitting here, right, for this. It turns out, this is what I read this morning, he had a tumor in his cheek. And you'll notice, if you look at his face, well, he looks like he just has wisdom teeth out, you know? Can you see that? It's really puffy on the right. And I didn't know this before, and I've been teaching art history for 27 years. I had no idea that he had a sword wound that ended up getting infected, and he had something growing inside. It turns out that's what killed him, right? Well, actually, that was not what killed him, but he was getting very sick. What killed him was he was leaving the theater, and he stepped out of the theater and got hit by a car, which is a horse-drawn car. So anyway, I found that to be very funny. Like, look before you leap, right? Look both ways. Didn't your mother tell you to look both ways, right? So, So anyway, Napoleon overthrows the revolutionaries. David joins this stable of artists that Napoleon has, doing different kinds of work. He primarily does portraits, right? In the work on the left, we see him wearing a medal. And the medal is the Legion of Honor medal, which is still one of the most prestigious rewards that France will give to any of its people, the French Legion of Honor. And in fact, the Legion of Honor was something that Napoleon had invented in 1802, right? To bestow upon those people in France who were doing great things for the country. And David, one of his court painters, was called upon to design the Medal of Honor. So he's shown here wearing the medal that he got from Napoleon, but it's a medal that he designed himself, right? So very proudly wearing it. And, not to be outdone, you'll notice that Napoleon's got a much bigger one. So that was kind of half hiding underneath his chest, and then has that circle with the stars around the outside. Right? That's the French Medal of Honor. So both of these really very much reflect his involvement with Napoleon. Right? So he's serving him all the way from 1800 to
between God versus the Son of death. Right? That's a good picture. Never mind. Never mind. And then stop playing around here. Right? Now something about the picture. But what they do is they decide that these three sons of Horus, triplets, right? And conveniently, a set of triplets on the other side are going to fight unto the death, right? Last of the six standing will be then declared the victor, and will stop this stupid, and they can demand what they want from the other people, right? We stop this senseless killing by more senseless killing. But still, okay? So there's the story. There's a complication. There you see, by the way, the three brothers in lockstep. It's so really nicely put together, isn't it? The arms reflecting the swords. You see how the arms are sort of together at the elbow, come apart at the hands, just like the swords are together at the throat, come apart at the tip. Embracing each other, right? They've got their arms around each other as they're swearing this oath. They've got their feet together, and there's Horus looking to God, asking him to bless these swords. I always make this joke that it's not really the best way to hold a sword, unless you want to lose all your fingers, right? You can just see that happening. Right? Yeah, it's like that is not. But you know what? This is for David. What we saw with that other work is how much he's really fascinated with trying to enhance drama, right? And so we saw Andromache sort of looking up to the light of God and questioning the fate of Hector, right? And here we see Horus looking up to the same sort of idea, up to the light of God. And for David, in order to emphasize the drama of the moment, for him it's more important to have dramatic gestures, right, and placements and facial features than it is to get. He needs them to hold three swords, to go with the three arms, to go with the three archways in the back, right, to go with the three women on the right with the two kids, right. He needs these triples. And so to get it so that you can read it, he will go against what's natural and realistic, right? And that's kind of an important point of this. And speaking of the three women, there is a complication. The families were interrelated by marriage. A secret wedding between one of the sisters and one of the other enemy triplets, right? And that means that the women know that this is going to be bad whether we win or lose, right? If we win, we lose. If we lose, we win. Or no, we lose, we lose, right? It's just bad no matter what. So, how it pans out, according to the history books, right, is that one of Horus's son is the last one standing, okay? The sister who was secretly married then tells him, the son of Horus, I was secretly married, and curses him for killing her husband. Right? God damn it, why'd you kill my husband? I shouldn't cuss because I got now recording myself. He lashes back at her, and he says, perish any woman who mourns the enemy. Right? And he kills her. Nice, huh? Kills her too. So he kills his sister after killing her husband and the husband's two brothers. And his two brothers are dead too, right? Okay? This is not when the story's over. You think that's bad enough, and it kind of is. Then Horus, the father, who, by the way, sent his sons off to do this stuff, right? Horus goes before the people of Rome and says, my son was acting on the will of Rome. He was fighting for us all. You should not charge him for any crime. And they agree. Right? So he's acquitted for murdering his sister because he was doing it for the good of Rome. Crazy story, right? But Romans love these sorts of stories because the whole point of it is a moral example, right? That you should never let personal concerns get in the way of your duty, your sworn duty, especially to country. Right? And for the director of the king's buildings, this is obviously incredibly nationalistic, right? Because this guy is going to kill his wife's or his sister's husband and then his sister because he's that kind of faithful to country. And that's exactly what the director of the king's buildings would probably do for the king, right?
So you can see how that's a good moral lesson for today, right, based on this. So what's interesting about this is that the commissioner, the patron, right, the director of the king's building, I don't want to bother you with his name, right, Janvier, I think, but don't worry about it, right? He had originally asked David for a different scene in the story. Both of them knew the story pretty well because it had recently been staged in Paris. There's a 17th century play on this story by the French equivalent of Shakespeare, Pierre Corneille, and had recently in the 1770s been staged in Paris. So both David and this minister, right, the director of the buildings, knew the story pretty well. And in the play, the ultimate scene, the climax, is when Horace goes to the people and says, "Acquit my son," right? And that's what the patron asked for. That's the scene he wanted. He wanted, again, high drama, right? He wanted Horace in front of the Roman people pleading for the acquittal of his son, who has done the wrong thing for the right reasons. Yeah, that's what he wants. So but this is what everybody should do. You know, don't act in self-interest. Think about the rising, sentiment of revolution at the time. Stop worrying about yourself. The state is more important, right? That's what he wants. Yeah. David pulls an audible. He does something that wasn't asked for. He does a different scene altogether. He does this swearing the oath, thinking that it's more dramatic, thinking that it's still nationalistic. But this has been one of those things, right, Sarah, that they point to, like by choosing this scene in the run-up to the revolution, swearing an oath to fight to the death for a cause greater than yourself, can be seen as a totally revolutionary theme too, right? They're going to fight to the death no matter what. And in fact, that's exactly how the revolutionaries saw it. They saw David as a subversive. But is he? And that's what we'll never have any proof. But when they finally start to commission works of art from David to commemorate the revolution, they call him David. You read the thing, and it says, we want David, the painter of the Horati, to do this. So they love this thing, right? This is what they want from him. So they're seeing it that way, whether he intended it or not. What we don't know is whether he intended it or not, right? So he changes the entire scene, right, from one subject to another, but they're both the same story. And the scene that he chooses here, which is the swearing of the oath, isn't in the play. He totally made it up, right? So that play that provided that whole story, he knew the Roman history that talks about that, right, but it doesn't occur on stage. So this is not any sort of image that he might have seen. It looks stagey, doesn't it? It looks like something you would see on a stage because it's a limited space, right? You can see them coming in from stage left and him coming in from stage right, and you can imagine the women talking before all of this, but it was never staged, right? David made the entire thing up, right? So it really is a terrific coup on his part, right, to pull that off and to get the minister to like it as well. Yeah, because it does maintain that idea of nationalism, and I have a detail. This is a little dark, but behind the women on the right, you can see there's a column with a piece of cloth draped over it, and there's a niche on the wall with a shelf. And on the niche, can you make this out? Here, right, is no, get rid of that because it kind of distracts, right? There's a bust of a bearded man. Can you see that? Right. So, right. This is the beard here. Right. There's the back of the head. See how well this responds. Right. There's the shoulder. Okay. So, and that certainly is an ancestor bust. So it really is all about family, ancestry, nation still, and including this little bit in the back helps with that. Right. We remember from intro that this idea of turning to ancient history for these sort of moral lessons is what the philosophers of the day, people like Voltaire, people like Rousseau, use this Latin term, exemplum virtutis, an example of virtue. Right? That makes the Latin a little easy to remember. It looks, as Latin goes, fairly easy. Right? Exemplum, We even use the word exemplar, don't we? What an exemplar that person's been. An exemplum is a thing, not a person, virtutis, virtue. So this is meant as either way, whether it's for the king or for the revolutionaries, it's meant as an example of virtue. And this is exactly what the French philosophes during the Enlightenment are saying. This is why you should study history, is to provide these moral lessons on how to conduct oneself today. Right? Well, the painting was a huge success, just massive success. It was shown in the salon first before it was going to be delivered to the donor, the person who paid for it, right? The patron. But it was so successful that David brought it back to his studio first and allowed visitors to come in, pay a little fee, and look at it in his studio before he sent it off to the director of buildings, right? So it reflects its popularity. A few years later, 2 years later, the death of Socrates. Does anybody know anything about Socrates? Can you tell me something about him? Kind of. He is a philosopher, ancient Greek philosopher, right? A little bit earlier than that. He was Plato's pupil. Studied under Plato. And in fact, that's Plato at the foot of his bed. Socrates is in the middle, highlighted, surrounded by other people. And you can tell, well, let's look at what's going on. Okay, what's Socrates up to? He's sitting there on his bed. Look at his hand gestures. What's he doing? Kind of outraged. He should be. In fact, he's about to die. Right? Look at his right hand on your left. What's he doing with his right hand? Reaching for that bowl, right? Something in that bowl, reaching for. It looks like it could be wine. And the person that's giving it to him, does he like the idea that he has to give this to him? Pretty obvious, right? Fairly straightforward read. So he's reaching for that bowl, and that figure doesn't want to give it to him. And now let's start to read the reactions of the people around him. Right? Look at the group on the right, the fellow in yellow and blue, or the fellow in red on the frame edge. The morning, right? They don't want to see this happen either. Look at the kid in the tunnel there, right? Leaning up against the wall. They're just all grief-stricken. And total David is it's so theatrical and showy. But by the way, this is in New York at the Met. If you ever go up there and you want to see it, it's fairly close by, right? So Socrates is reaching for that cup, and nobody's happy that he's doing it. So what's in the cup? Poison, right? It's a distillation of hemlock, which is what killed him, right? And at the foot of the bed, the fellow in gray on the left is Plato, and you'll notice that he's very stoic, right? Contemplative, whereas the others are much more demonstrative, right? So he's being poisoned, but he's accepting it willfully. And you'll notice that he's pointing up. Very much like, you remember the School of Athens by Raphael in the Sistine Chapel where, right, Plato is pointing up because they're both metaphysics. They're both into the idea of a greater good beyond the chaos of this world. So he's pointing to the source of the greater good, like pointing up as he reaches for the glass of hemlock. The reason he willfully takes the hemlock is that he had been accused by the people of Athens of corrupting the youth of Athens and refusing to recognize the state gods, right, the deities of Athens. So for these two crimes, atheism on one hand, right, or at least not following the official rules on the one hand, and using his teaching to corrupt the children. Not children's not the right word, right? College students. Yeah. These are his crimes. He is told you will be put to death by poison, and he's been kept in prison. You can see the shackles down below, right? He's been let loose so that he can take his poison. And around him are his followers, the kids. You see how many of them are quite young? Look, for example, at, okay, hang on a second. This kid here, these ones here, right? This kid over here. You can see how much they all are very much the youth of Athens, and they are mourning this terrible event. In the back, in the very back, are the people who have condemned him, and they're leaving this to take place behind their backs, right? They trust him to do it, and he will then willfully. Oh, what's going on there? I didn't mean to do that. Stop that now. Go away. That's what I meant to do, right? And David is interested in these different ways of showing mourning during this. One of his followers, Crichton, is seated there in the red, clutching at his knee. Plato at the foot, and there you can see the figures in the back. You know, bye now, right? See you, but they're the ones who have condemned him to death. And so if we think about this having a moral example, right? An example of virtue. What's the virtue? What's the lesson, you know, the history lesson you should take from this? How could this make you a better person? Danielle, do you want to try it?
Like the message you try to convey is kind of the same thing, or is like if you see your country world, what's gonna happen?
No, because he was breaking all the law. Oh, I see. So it's a negative example.
Like one more.
Yeah. Except Socrates is such a positive figure. You know, you don't. Saul Silverman, the stand-up comic, once said you can't make jokes about MLK. You know, because there's certain people who just are off limits for jokes, and the same thing I think would hold true for Socrates is that I don't think he would ever stand as a negative example. But it's a nice idea, right? But there is something else here, I think. Go ahead,
Would it be
Kiki.
like doing the good for your country and now the consequences of it? So he knew that he did something bad, but he's a sacrifice anyway. It would be better.
Yeah. I think that's mostly true, with the exception of the country part, because I think in many ways this is not necessarily an example of virtutis does not have to be about country, right? Even though the one that we saw was very much about country, because after all, it was commissioned by, right, a member of the royal court. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily, but I think you're on the right track there, right? That puts us on the right track about tough decisions that have to be made. Danielle. Mm-hmm.
So then it was kind of like a go down with this shit.
Yeah.
He was passing on all this knowledge that he was thrown off the other.
Yeah.
And he knew he was right, but he knew he would die anyway.
Yeah. You ever hear this quote? It's by one of the Enlightenment philosophers. It's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Mankind. This is a loose quote, right? Everywhere mankind longs to be free, and yet he is in chains. And I think that's, if we take these ideas and put it in with that in many ways, yes, it's good to be steadfast to ideals. That's what we're talking about, right? But on the other hand, it's also better to die than to give up what you believe in, right? It's better to die free, the chains are loose now, than to be shackled to a false philosophy, to something that you know is not right. Yeah? So, again, these two works show us the degree to which David is using ancient history, this neoclassical idea of reviving scenes and styles, motifs and figures from classical periods, whether it's the Renaissance or ancient Greece and Rome, to tell these stories that are meant to be relevant, right, to people of the day. Okay. Now, in May 1789 is the first French Revolution. Louis XVI, and here's a bit more historical background. Right? I'm not going to test you word for word on historical background, so you can put your pen down and just sort of soak this in. Because people always wonder, well, what happened? How did the French Revolution happen? And Louis XVI wanted to raise taxes. this is an election cycle. Doesn't this sound like the infamous political third rail, right? You don't want to raise taxes. And his advisors, in order to give it legitimacy, this demand to raise taxes, suggested that what Louis XVI should do is to revive a very, very old practice called convening the Estates General. This goes back to the Middle Ages, where the different sectors of society would come together to be all sort of feel they're part of the decision-making process, right? So the Estates General. And that meant that there are 3 estates in French society. Estates is like groups, right? And they were the nobles, which would include the aristocrats, the kings, the dukes, the earls, the counts, right? The nobles, the clergy, and the third would be the peasantry, who under the old feudal system were under the nobles, but were a separate estate. And according to medieval French political theology, you couldn't move between them. With the exception of being a noble, you could become part of the clergy, right? But you couldn't be a really good peasant and become a noble. It just didn't happen, right? You were frozen in your estate, okay? So the idea of getting them all together to give them the simulation of a voice, even though he's just going to raise taxes anyway, but now people feel they were part of the process, right? Okay, so he's going to get the representatives together, and the estates, by the way, by Louis's time, unlike the Middle Ages, had also come to include the urban bourgeois, right? Workers, merchants, craftsmen in the cities, which didn't exist in the Middle Ages, right? Because they were still part of that old fabric. So at this point, the third estate, right, nobles, clergy, and peasantry, the third estate included also people who had grown up in Paris and Lyon, right, the major French cities, okay? Only the nobles and the clergy supported what Louis was trying to do, and the third estate rebelled, right? They formed a new self-governing body in rebellion against the king. This was unheard of, right? And they called themselves the National Assembly. This is coming up the wrong way around. Let's see if it comes back. I can go back. They were the National Assembly, and I was making that, somehow my little animation didn't work, right? So they call themselves the National Assembly, and they meet. Their first gathering is inside an indoor tennis court, where they swear to work together to draft a new constitution for France, or die trying. So that's what we see on the left. David has moved from ancient history to contemporary history, right? The oath at the tennis court memorializes this moment when the third estate is gathering together to work for the good of what they believe to be France, right? Toward a brighter future, okay? Meanwhile, while this is all going on, right, 1789, there's national unrest because there's a lot of famine, food shortages all over France. And Louis has this third estate who had sworn together. He has them arrested because he's trying to return peace. He wants to, and the whole point of raising taxes is to be able to pay for things because the crops are gone, et cetera, right? So he has them rounded up, this group, and thrown in the Bastille, which is this massive prison in Paris, which is no longer there because it was eventually torn down, right, within a few years of this. Right? So the third estate, the leaders of the third estate, are all rousted up, thrown into jail. Anybody can get his hands on, right, is thrown into jail, right? In 1789, again, the same year, 3 months later, right, March is when we started this. On July 14th, which is now French Independence Day, right, rioters stormed the Bastille to free the political dissidents, right? So they charged the prison. And the National Assembly renamed itself the Constitutional Assembly, and they abolished the Regency, which is pretty incredible, right? French kings can trace their history back to around 850 or so AD, right? There have been lines of French kings in power that were all ostensibly related to each other, right? Sometimes distantly, but almost 1,000 years, right, of French kings. And they say, we are not going to have another French kings, right? And on August 27th, that same year, they draft a new constitution. Let's see what's coming up next. Come to Papa. There. Work for me. There. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, which guarantees liberty and equality to every Frenchman. Right? Louis refuses to comply. He refuses to ratify their constitution, so the mob storms his palace in Versailles and takes him prisoner. Right? They'd gone to him and said, look, this is the future. Everybody's going to be equal. It's a good thing. Right? Louis said, I ain't signing that. Right? So they take him prisoner in 1789, eventually executed him in 1793. Right? Sarah.
Are supposed to portray like them coming together and then like why are they fighting them? A lot of them are like arguing with each other.
Oh no, they're not. I think you're misreading it. I think what happened. Well, that is an interesting thing. I don't know if that's really the case. I think they're cheering. See, they have their hats off,
but
right?
People on the left and the front, it looks like they're strangling one another.
Where are you looking? Are you looking at? Let's see. No, I want the smart floating tools. Is it these guys down here?
Yeah.
Boy, you may know you've taken your French history more recently than I have. Yeah. There definitely was a lot of conflict within the group, and we'll talk more about that. There was the more radical side, and there was the more moderate side of the French revolutionists. But I think at this point we're meant to see it as working together, because you'll notice that all of the hands, right, are pointing right toward the guy in the middle that's showing off the that's reading the oath. And down in the front we even have representatives of the three estates, right? There's even a clergyman there as well, right? So I think that we are meant to be seeing it differently than the way you're reading it, which is not to say that it's wrong by any means, because I think that we'll find that there is quite a bit of conflict here.
Right. They're really excited.
They're very excited, exactly, because for them this is the bright future. You know, this is things are going to be better than they were before, right? So that's certainly the case. Okay, and so where's my next picture? Come on, there we go. 4 years later, Louis XVI was beheaded, January 1793, followed by his wife, Marie Antoinette, in October. Jacques-Louis David, as I said before, signed the death warrant, along with the other revolutionaries, right, the most radical wing of the revolutionaries, and he was there looking on as they were led to the scaffold. Made this drawing of Marie Antoinette, her hands behind her back, as she's led off to be beheaded, right? So he's a witness to major political upheaval and also a participant as well. You know, not a passive bystander in all of this. Now, this picture on our left is the tennis court oath, right, where they're swearing allegiance to fight together unto death. And it was commissioned by the radical arm of the revolutionaries, who are called the Jacobin Club. And it's an odd name. They used to rent a Dominican monastery in Paris where they would meet, and the Dominicans were called the Jacobins in French, so they became known as the Jacobin Club because they were hanging out in this monastery that they were renting, right? And the reason they were called Jacobins is that the monastery was on Rue Saint-Jacques, right? Jacobins. So this is why you actually find in French that the Dominicans are almost always called the Jacobins, or even the Dominicans themselves, even though these guys aren't Dominican. Yeah? Yeah.
Did he purposely not finish that? Or?
Yes, we're getting there. This is unfinished work. It's a fragment of a huge work. This fragment on the right is 21 feet across. And you can see that it's only kind of the lower right half of this. And you can also see how David is working, because you can pick out, if you see the group there binding together the three estates, you'll notice that David, in working this composition up, is going to do it. First, they're going to be life-size, right? That's, or even larger than life-size. That's almost 12 feet tall. So yeah, they're roughly life-size, right? They're roughly 6 feet tall. And even though they're all going to be clothed, he's going to work it up first nude, right? And then clothe them, because he's studied anatomy. So the guy on the far right, I love the fact that he's there bare butt naked with this painted face, right, on the right. The painting that they asked David, and this is where they said, we want David, the painter of the Herati, right, is going to be this massive memorial to the revolution, the greatest thing that's ever happened in France, or so they think, right? Jacques-Louis David was a founding member of the group, one of the original Jacobins, and in 1793, during the year of all those beheadings, he was actually president of the Jacobins. Like, he's a prominent player in this revolutionary group. He's not just some sort of fringy outsider, right? And the painting was going to be huge. It was going to hang in the National Assembly Hall. It was going to include 630 different portraits. So over 600 people were going to sit for their portrait, right? And each be recognizable in the picture. They were going to pay for this. You might say, pay for this, right? Well, they've got the coffers of the king, but they're not going to, that's going to go to the people. This is going to be self-funding. What they're going to do is they're going to sell engravings of the composition. And that sort of subscription will pay for the painting, right? All the supplies, what David needs, et cetera, and the picture on your left, this monochrome picture, is going to be used by an engraver to make the engravings, right? That's why this little watercolor is on the left, which is small by comparison, but it's still fairly large. I think it's like, 3.5 feet across, right? It's going to make a huge lithograph probably from it, right? And distribute that, okay? And we did the same thing here, right, with the famous picture in the Capitol Dome of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, right, is printed up at the same time for wider distribution for anybody that wanted it as a memorial, okay? He didn't get very far, as you can see, right? We only have a fragment of the canvas, and it is only fragmentarily painted, right? He didn't get very far. And the reason for this goes back to what Sarah had mentioned, is that there was some infighting here. The radical wing, the Jacobins, and the moderate wing, the Girondins, they were both present when the oath was signed, but they didn't see eye to eye. And if one of the two groups was sort of in power at the time, the other one was seen as the enemy. They were seen as outcasts, less important. So if he's working on the portrait, he's working on the Jacobins, and all is well and good, and all of a sudden the Girondins sort of tip the scales in their direction, then he's got to stop working on them and start, he can't progress freely, right? In the picture on the left, the guy in the center with his hand up, who's actually swearing the oath, right? We will fight until death for freedom, right? He was a Girondin. And he was beheaded in 1793 during this huge purge. That's how bad they didn't get on, right? So you can see the kind of thing he's got. He's got his 600 of these portraits. He's never going to get it done. And of course, he never does, right? You'll notice, if you look at the left-hand part of this composition, particularly right around sort of here, how many times David picks up the composition of the Herati. Again and again and again, right? You see the arms raised together in tandem, and you see it all other places. I mean, you start to pick it up back there as well, You can see that he is always returning this composition, and they probably asked for that because they hired him as David, the painter of the Herati, right? They want that from him. So he's using this Roman composition, which was an example of virtue anyway, as a direct parallel to what's going on in France today, right? And what's really fascinating is that the oath of the tennis court ended up 2 years after the revolution in the salon that's being still held, the Royal Academy Salon. I think they still called it the Royal Academy too. I don't know. I never really thought about that before. Must have called it something else during this time, right? Yeah, probably just the Academy, indeed. Or probably the Académie Française would make some sense. But this goes into the show. They keep the old traditions of the annual salon. And when he puts up the oath of the tennis court in the show, he hangs the oath of the Hirati next to it. It goes back into the salon for a second, return engagement, right? Even though it's an older painting, because what David wants you to see by putting these side by side is how a knowledge of history informs the present, how lessons we learn from noble ancient Romans. And you may think twice about the nobility of killing your sister, I do. But nonetheless, how that can then inform modern activities, right? He definitely wants that to be seen. Okay. Well, David continues to be involved in politics even after the revolution. In 1793, the year that the guy in the center was killed in the oath at the tennis court, that year, the Jacobin Party, the Radical Party, commissioned portraits of 3 martyrs to the cause. And these were commissioned in the immediate aftermath of the beheading of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, right? Because that brutal violence was met with some resistance. Okay? And in fact, to this day, do you know what the French call this period, 1793? The year 1793 is known as by a nickname in French history. Do you remember this, Gracie, from before? You had that other stuff ready. That's all right. It was called the Terror, because this is when they got so good at this, right? And the leader of the Jacobin Party at the time was Maximilien Robespierre, who was good friends with Jacques-Louis David, and he's the one that's insisting on these killings. 17,000 people were beheaded in 11 months throughout the city, not just in Paris, but throughout the country, right? It's a massive amount, right? We're talking 1,500 a month. The worst month was 2,000, I think, in August or something. So there's, needless to say, a little image problem here, right? There's a little, I don't want to make light of it, but I mean, it's just, they're having a little PR problem, right? People are turning against them. And so they want to show the people of France that good people have died as well on the other side. As if that's somehow going to offset 17,000 people, right? But nonetheless, that's kind of the idea. And I guess, I don't know, old habits die hard, right? We're talking about people who began this class at a period when not everybody was equal, right? So Marat was a journalist who, prior to the revolution, had written some very progressive articles advocating for the common man. He was one of the sort of philosophers, if you will, behind the cause of giving equal rights to everybody, right? He also suffered from a skin ailment, which meant that he had to sit in a tub full of ointment almost all day long. So what he did would be to write. He didn't let that get in the way. Think about that next time you call him sick, right? His skin hurt so bad, right? He had eczema all over. It was peeling and painful, burning sensation. So he sat in a tub of ointment to soothe it, right? And yet he kept working. He worked from the tub. And so he's got his little green felt table there that he's writing on with his quill pen, ink there. You can see, even though it's blood-stained, some of the things he's been working on, right? So he's not going to be stopped for anything. He's a moral example, right? Don't let anything get in the way. He was murdered by Charlotte Corday, and there's a note from her introducing herself to him. She was a supporter of the aristocracy. She wanted to see a return to the old system after the revolution, right? So remember, now we're in this period, 1793, when Louis's been imprisoned, right? He's not dead yet, or he's actually, when he paints this, he is, right? But there's a chance that this revolution could just be overturned, just go back the way it was. And that's what Charlotte Corday and others wanted. And so what they got her to do was to sneak in and kill him. And what she did is, here, look at that date. 13th of July, the day before the 4th anniversary, right? The 4th anniversary of the French Revolution, 14th of July, 1793. Marie-Anne Charlotte Corday to Citizen Marat, it says. And basically, this it's one of those French phrases that doesn't really translate exactly. But if all I would need to see you, to have the grace of your presence, is if I were unhappy. In other words, you're so kind, you would see me just because I'm unhappy, because you believe so much in the rights of everybody. And so that's what she's given him, right? And he, oh, of course I'll see you, right? And she knifes him, and there's the bloody knife laying down below, and there's this wonderful pairing of the pen and the sword, that his writings will live on even though he's been physically silenced. Another quill pen there on the table, more of his writings on the table, and this implicating her, right? Blood-stained. Notice the bloody thumbprint even on it, as well as the blood on the papers that are directly beneath his forearm, right? So totally meant as propaganda. David's the perfect guy for it because he's just high drama, so good, right? So terribly, terribly well. And again, it's that Caravaggio lighting, right? The up-close focus of the figure really emphasizes this. It's signed at the bottom, A Marat, which means in honor of Marat, and then his name, David, and it's signed as if it were carved into that little wooden inkstand, right? And down below, you can see it actually says 1793, but it's been kind of scrubbed out in the corners, 17 on the left, 93 on the right. And instead of that, in the middle, directly beneath where it says David, it says L'an deux, the second year of centralized control. After it took them a couple years after the revolution to get everything together. So the Constitution came out in 1791, right? So this is L'an deux, the second year of the new Constitution, right? Well, David knew Marat, and he was allowed into the crime scene to draw the body. He had spent the evening before he was killed with him. They were friends. And this is the drawing that he did of the dead face of Marat. You'll notice in the life drawing, if you will, sorry, but the drawing from observation, that he looks significantly skinnier. And that what David has done in the finished picture is to turn him into something more muscular and heroic, because that's in keeping with the theme of this picture, which is to show the great martyr to the cause, right? Who's fallen fighting for liberty, yeah? And so just like the swords that Father Horace holds, it's not realistic at all, right? The other thing he does, and this is, I think, fairly obvious if you know your way around artistic traditions, he looks like Jesus as well. That slung arm down we can find in any one of hundreds of images of the dead Christ held by his mother, right? A Pietà image, and he looks exactly like a dead Christ. There's a Caravaggio that David saw in Rome that would have totally been the basis for this. One last thing and then we'll quit. David was, I don't know about the date on that, and it may not be in your text anymore. That's from, I couldn't find my text this morning. My wife says it's underneath my desk, leaning up against the wall. But anyway, so don't quote me on 4/7, but it might be 4/7. David was called upon to, in addition to paint this, he was also called upon to design the funeral memorial for Marat. And when they did in the church in Paris, they laid the body of Marat, which you see here, right, just here, they arranged his body in the same pose as the picture and lit it in the church in the same way as the picture. So there's strong light coming in from your upper left. And you can even see this in the print commemorating that this was all part of this kind of stagecraft, right? Well, where we are here, we're almost at 4:45. There was a huge public backlash against the revolutionaries, despite the propaganda that they've asked David to do. Right? There's a huge backlash against them. And in 1794, the Jacobin group is disbanded. Right? Robespierre is accused of tyranny and is executed himself. Ha! Right? That'll teach you to be killing 17,000 people, right? Watch out what you hope for. You make a nice, efficient way of killing people, and then you get to put your head there as well, right? David was arrested that same year, 1794, because he'd been so tight with them all. And he was accused as a, this is totally French sounding, isn't it? He was a tyrant of the arts. Right? That's what they said about him. But he was locked up. And in his defense on trial, he argued that Robespierre had deceived him. The head of the Jacobins had deceived him. That it's not my fault I was led asunder. I was led astray. I guess it sort of sounds, this is a bad analogy because he's not a Nazi and we should never compare things to Nazis. But Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg were saying, I just was doing what I was told to do. I was deceived. And you find people all the time saying that. I'm just doing what I was told to do. I was deceived. And it got David off. Right? I mean, it got him released from prison for basically, I followed orders. Right? On his release from prison, David said, from here on out, I will follow my principles and not any man. Right? Because he felt betrayed by Robespierre. So he let being told what to do and doing it get in the way of a principled approach. This doesn't last. He ends up falling in with Napoleon almost immediately. So that's where we'll pick up on Friday. I think that required reading on Aang, the first required reading, will probably be on Tuesday. Okay, that looks like how that's shaken out, is that we'll get to that on Tuesday. Okay, so if you want to start budgeting your time, that first reading by Occam, I think her name is, or Ockman, on Aang, I-N-G-R-E-S, you should plan on having a copy with you one way or the other, either your computer or a printed copy a week from today. Okay? So for Friday, you should be thinking about what work of art you want to work on and getting in touch with me about that. And if you're having trouble making your mind up, please, please contact me. Okay? Good. See you soon.
Thank you.